Okay, hello everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining from. We have a big group here today, so thank you for being at this IUCN WCPA Vital Sites webinar. We have a few people trickling in, but just as a reminder, this webinar is being interpreted and you can select your preferred language between English and Spanish using the interpretation sign at the bottom of the webinar here. We've also added it to the chat. But we're really happy to see so many participants in this Vital Sites webinar today. My name is Erin Drage, and I'm the Executive Officer for the International Union for Conservation of Nature World Commission on Protected Areas. And this webinar today is part of a series we co-host with the IUCN Protected and Conserved Areas team called Vital Sites. And the Vital Sites webinar series is a way to share knowledge and build momentum leading up to the IUCN World Conservation Congress, the next of which will be happening in Abu Dhabi next year in 2025. And we're hosting this mini Vital Sites webinar series leading up to the Convention on Biological Diversity COP16, which is happening in Colombia next month. So we are really happy to be sharing some priority topics from within IUCN and within the Commission on area-based conservation. And today we're focusing on protected areas effectiveness and how we can maximize the effectiveness of our protected areas for biodiversity and conservation outcomes. And we're really pleased to have an excellent panel of presenters today joining us. As mentioned at the beginning, for those just joining, we'll have presentations in both English and Spanish, and you can choose your live interpretation preference using the settings at the bottom of this webinar. But without further ado, I would love to pass it over to our hosts extraordinaire of the webinar today. I'm going to pass the floor to Nick Salavsky, who will be starting us off with an overview of some amazing work that's been happening in WCPA on protected areas effectiveness this year. So Nick, over to you.
Thanks for that. So welcome everybody. My name is Nick Salavsky. I'm also going to be presenting with my co-chair of our task force, Paula Mejia. Paula is on the call. Unfortunately, she's in a situation in a city with a blackout right now, so she's a little tenuous of her connections, but she will be here and hopefully be able to answer questions as well as we go forward. So as Erin said, we are two objectives: to provide an update on some recent work to integrate effectiveness measures into ongoing protected area adaptive management, and then showcase how this work has been applied in Chile and beyond. So I will be speaking for about 30 minutes on behalf of Paula, our overview presentation. Then we will turn it over to our colleague Mariano, who will talk about a case study from Chile, and then we should have time for questions and discussion. And along the way, we'll also be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat and we can hopefully respond to them. Okay, so this is the overview presentation. It's about using outcome-based effectiveness assessments to improve the adaptive management of protected areas. As I mentioned, both Paula and I are co-chairs of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, WCPA Task Force, which is really about looking at effectiveness. And so a lot of this work is representing the work of the overall task force. As many or most of you probably...
Yes. Nick, just in case you are not sharing your screen.
I'm not sharing my screen. Well, that would help. Sorry about that. Let's see if I can make that work. Thank you for telling me. All right, let's try that again. So this is using outcome-based effectiveness assessments to improve the adaptive management of protected areas. That's Paula, that's me, and so we're the co-chairs of this task force. And as many of you know, Target 3 has gotten the world very excited. And it's really about getting 30% of the world's areas, marine and coastal and terrestrial areas, in protected areas. But it's not just any old protected area, it's protected areas that are effectively conserved and managed. And so the key here, if we're going to reach this target, is agreeing on how to assess effectiveness in the context of ongoing management efforts. So what we're going to talk about here is really several different groups maybe that are climbing the same mountain as a metaphor. So one group that we're going to talk about is something called the Conservation Measures Partnership. It's a group that some of us has been involved in for many years now, and it's trying to help the world think about better adaptive management through something called the CMP conservation standards. The same mountain has also been climbed by the WCPA, the World Commission on Protected Areas, that is interested in effective assessments of protected areas and also OECMs in the context of 30 by 30. And so we're going to talk about first the CMP conservation standards. We're going to talk about the other team that's going up this mountain, what WCPA is up to. And then Mariana will bring these two things together by bringing together both the Red Parkus and Chile examples. And sorry, both mountains are supposed to be there, so they would be there. So if we think about protected areas, starting with that first part, protected areas take place in very complicated and dynamic systems. They need to deal with ongoing and unpredictable change and are dealing with rapidly changing competitors. So the rest of the world is out there. Protected area managers never have complete information. They must take immediate action in the face of uncertainty. They need to report their performance to agencies and stakeholders, and they can improve and learn. So you can see that the job of protected area manager is very difficult. There's this idea called adaptive management that's been floating around for a number of years now. And some people think adaptive management means I can do whatever I want. I'll try something, and if it doesn't work, I'll tell my boss that I'm managing adaptively. And we don't think that that's really what adaptive management is. If you go back to the 1970s or the 1980s, an academic called C.S. Holling, Buzz Holling, and a bunch of his colleagues had a really interesting idea that in the natural resource sector, rather than using command and control approaches, which assume that we know how the system works and how to change it, that in complicated systems, we could manage for ecological resilience, that we would treat our policy or our actions as experiments, we would develop models of the system, and then we would see what worked and didn't work and learn as we go. So they had this really interesting idea about how to do management in complicated systems. But the problem is that they were academics, and the way they approached things didn't really translate necessarily for practitioners. But what their idea was to be an adaptive manager is to combine action and research. So that if you're just a pure practitioner, all you're interested in is the results, and you're going to be in what people might call ready, fire, aim mode. So you're just going to do without thinking about it because you need to put out fires, you need to get things done. On the other end of the spectrum, you might have an academic researcher, a pure researcher, who all they're interested in is knowledge. And so when it comes to action, they're going to be ready, 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 ready. They're never really going to take action because they always need to get some more information before they can act. We want to be in the middle as an adaptive manager, where we want to be in this cycle of ready, aim, fire, but then reflect and adapt. And so it's this idea that we're interested in both results and knowledge. We're combining action and research to get things done in a smarter way. So a bunch of organizations that you see here, way back in 2002, got together and spent an afternoon or a day talking about the different performance management systems that they were using in their organizations. And what we found is that we were all doing similar things and had similar systems, but we were confusing each other with words and how we describe things. So what one group called a focal target, another group called an outcome, another called a goal. And so all these different words were being used to basically talk about the same thing. At the same time, we went and looked at what the rest of the world was doing. So how does the business and management world think about performance and learning? How does education and social service? How does international development, the public health, the environment and conservation world? And so we did research on all these different systems, and we boiled it down into something we called the Open Standards for the Practice of Conservation. Version 1 came out in 2004. We applied it, we learned about it, and came up with version 2. We thought about it some more, did some more work, came up with version 3 in 2013. And in 2020, released version 4.0, and we're now working on version 5.0. And what these are a set of best practices for doing conservation work in general. You're going through steps in a management cycle, and I'll go through those steps in just a second. It's nothing radically new. People have known about this for hundreds of years, this kind of thinking, but the standards really think about how to do this in a systematic way, in a way that makes sense in conservation. And so the Conservation Partnership today is grown into many different organizations from around the world that are all working on these standards. And really what we're interested in is managing what the conservation standards would call a project. So a project is maybe an area where you have a team, and that team has certain things that they care about, and they're taking action to save those things. So maybe jaguars or forests, maybe as a human well-being target, that forest provides the municipal water supply for a forest ecosystem. Projects are general, but you can see here that a project could also be a protected area. So we can think about a protected area, or it could be an OECM area, but that area is really the same thing as a project in the way that CMP thinks about these things. So each project has one or more pathways leading to desired outcomes. So the steps in the standards ask that project team to talk about the scope. What is it that you're trying to manage? Are you trying to manage a large national park, an entire ocean? Or maybe in this case, we're helping this communities to set up a traditional, manage their fishing grounds, their traditional fishing grounds, using various principles. So you define the scope of your project. You talk about who's on the team, so who's involved in that management process, the core team, the project team, advisors, and then stakeholders. And then the very first step is to develop a model of the system. So we ask people to say, well, what is it that you care about? We care about turtles as an outcome or as a value that we care about. And then we might think about what are the problems facing those turtles? Well, maybe those are being harvested for people's dinner. We also care about fish, but they're being commercially harvested, but they're an important protein source for the community. So models sound very fancy, but it's really just a common picture of what's going on in the situation so that we all on the team have a shared mental model, a shared understanding of what's happening. Then once you do that, you plan your actions about how you're going to change the system. We want a strategic plan, but a strategic plan is not just a 300-page document. It's about being able to say, what are you going to spend your time on? What will you do? But also, what are you not going to do and why? And so the standards give you a bunch of tools to say which values require attention, which threats are most critical, and how do we spend our limited time and treasure to change the situation. So back in this example here, the community decides that, well, they have a fishing ground, and traditionally the community would set up a harvest taboo, that they had an indigenous management system that they would use. It's gone away for the last couple generations, and they want to bring it back. So their action is to bring back that traditional harvest taboo. If they do that, clams can reproduce in the no-take area. If they do that, we'll have a healthy clam population. If we do that, there'll be spillover, the clams will be breeding. And if we do that, we'll have more clams to harvest. So the community has stated how they think their action is going to lead to the intermediate results and then the outcomes that they ultimately want to have. So that's what we call a theory of change that shows how your actions lead to your desired outcomes. And it's very important. On it, you can put the goals, what you ultimately want to accomplish, but you can also put your objectives, and you can put indicators to track your success. So you can make a SMART goal, a SMART objective, and then your indicators. And then you can also look at the uncertainties in your assumptions, and you can lay out what evidence you have behind them. So the really critical thing about the conservation standards is to lay out this, you could call it an assumption or a hypothesis about how your actions are leading to their desired outcomes. Why do we do all that? Well, in part because then we can then implement our actions, but we can also figure out what to monitor. So in this case, the community is going to count the numbers and sizes of clams inside and outside the no-take zone. Step 4 is to analyze that information. So here you can see the blue boxes were the numbers and sizes of clams before they did the intervention. The orange boxes were the numbers and sizes of clams after they did the intervention. And in this case, their hypothesis, their assumption held. They set up the no-take zone and they had more and bigger clams. But sometimes you find that maybe your assumption doesn't hold. That's okay. But the key is to then use that information to modify and change what you're doing. So we're doing effectiveness assessments for improving, for making the management better, rather than just to prove to the world that we know what we're doing. It's really about that improvement. So what this lets us do is then get into a cycle of pause and reflect. So in this case, the strategy, the thing we do, these are the intermediate results. These are the activities that the management team is doing, and these are the outcomes we're supposed to have. In this case, our analysis, our effectiveness assessment shows we got the results done that we wanted. We did the activities that we wanted to do. And so therefore, we might conclude that this is a success. But you might get a situation where you didn't do the activities that you set out to do. So that's what the red is showing here. And you didn't see any change in the system. You didn't see any changes in the results you were hoping to have. So in this case, you might conclude you have implementation failure. Something went wrong. Maybe it's because you didn't have enough money to support your project team. Maybe it's because you had a pandemic and people couldn't get to the field to do work. Maybe it's because you have a very lazy project team that needs a little motivation. Something went wrong with your implementation that you need to fix. Here's another case where you did what you said you were going to do, so you achieved your activities, but you're not seeing the changes you're expecting to see in the system. And in this case, your team might conclude you had what we call a theory failure. You had the wrong strategies because you did them, but you're not seeing the change you were hoping to see. Or maybe you did have the right strategies, but the world changed once, and so you have to adjust your strategies because something's wrong. And then finally, you get a case where you don't do what you said you wanted to do, but you are seeing the results that you're expecting to see. And this is the case where maybe you got lucky. Maybe something else happened in the world to get the results you're hoping to see. So you're using your adaptation to really improve your management over time by asking these questions. Did we do what we said we're going to do? Are we seeing the results that we're expecting to see? And then do we need to do anything different? There is one more case, is that you also might have bad monitoring. You just have to be aware of that as well. So that's the fourth step of the standards. The fifth step is to capture and share your learning. So you've learned a lot as a project team, and you want to share that with your project team about what's working, what's not. But you also want to share it with the rest of the world so they can benefit and not make the same mistakes that you're making. So for us, adaptive management is going through the conservation standards, these steps in orderly fashion. Different organizations and agencies might have their own version of this. This is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service version of this. This is USAID's version of this, and we've spent a lot of time working with them to help improve their cycle. This is a version called Healthy Country Planning that was pioneered in Australia and is now spreading to the rest of the world. And it's for working with Aboriginal and Indigenous peoples to go through this kind of planning as they manage their territories of life, as they work on their different lands that they're managing. So it's a little speaks to them in a language that makes sense for them. And I would say, as you'll see, that countries also have their own planning systems. So as you'll see in Peru or in Chile, they have planning systems for their protected areas that are incorporating and using these standards. So you don't have to use the standards, but you're bringing these principles into the management work that you're doing. Okay, so I have just given you the first part of this presentation, the people climbing the mountain from the Conservation Measures Partnership to think about effectiveness through the conservation standards. And now I want to talk about the second part of the mountain, which is coming up with effectiveness assessments that are feasible, credible, and useful for ongoing management. Before I do that, Paula, are there any questions in the chat that I need to respond to? Are we good?
Okay.
Okay, and I will keep going. So the second part of the story is the task force that is trying to think about coming up with better effectiveness measures. And being good practitioners, we have our own theory of change of what we're trying to accomplish. So what we're setting out to do is to, and I'll show you this in more detail, but come up with a look at all the frameworks and tools that are out there for effectiveness and compile them and analyze them to see if we can come up with principles for what a good framework and approach might be. We're using that to identify and agree on high-level results and indicators that can be used to track effectiveness. We then want to work with different managers of different frameworks and tools to help them improve their frameworks and tools, such as the MET or the Green List or various tools that are out there. And then hopefully those data from existing framework tools will be easily incorporated into standard assessments so that we can take all those information from those tools and create standard assessments of protected areas and OECMs. And if we do that, PAs and OECMs will have public, credible, current, and useful outcome-based effectiveness assessments. If we do that, PA and OESM members can use assessments to improve their practices. They should also be able to get the needed technical and capacity support to fill gaps. So we'll have more effective PAs, OESMs, and systems. Also, 30 by 30 commitments can be tracked, and broader society will have confidence in PAs and provide sufficient support. So this is our overall theory of change for our task force. I'm going to now go into a little bit more detail about what we've been doing on each of these activities to make this happen. So we're starting by compiling a Rosetta Stone and agreeing on principles and framework for an approach. So what we did is started to look at all the existing and frameworks and tools that are out there. And there's lots of them. There's actually dozens, many dozens of them. So what's a framework? A framework might be a way of thinking about effectiveness. And probably one of the first and most famous was the PAME framework that was developed in around 2000. So that is a framework for assessing the management of effectiveness of protected areas. That framework then spawned or had with it several tools, including, for example, the management effectiveness tracking tool. So that's a tool based on the PAME framework that people use to look at effectiveness. Another example, this would be the green list of protected areas, the standard. So that standard is a framework that defines what effectiveness is or what you need to track. And then there's various tools that are used to implement the green list as people seek certification, or if you look at IBEX as a self-assessment tool. Of course, countries have their own frameworks. So this is, for example, the Peruvian framework. There's a Chilean framework that's out there as well. And then in a funny way, the conservation standards that I just shared are another framework to think about effectiveness. So we took all those different frameworks, our task force, and we looked at their components and the results that they had that used to define effectiveness. And first, we just looked at them in their original order. But then what we did is we scrambled them and lined them up so we could see that when framework I talked about this component, that was the same as component M in tool 2. Framework 3 didn't have an equivalent. So we actually lined these up with each other to see where there were common things that these frameworks and tools were tracking and where they had gaps. So we were really able to look at and do that kind of analysis. We then used this to come up with some principles to think about how we might want to think about effectiveness going forward. And our first principle is that effectiveness needs to be thought about at both individual area and network levels. So I already showed you a version of this picture, but basically we can think about a protected area as being a team that has multiple things that it's trying to achieve, values it's trying to reach, and it has different strategies that they're taking to get there. But we also can think about that area as being part of a network, so a network of different areas. And that network is in a PA or OECM system. And there's also work happening at the system level to conserve the things that the system cares about as well. So we have to think about this both at the area level and the network level for both PAs and OECMs. Okay, second point is that if we think about effectiveness, we need to think about it both in terms of process and outcomes. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a metaphor to think about that. So you all just saw the Olympics, and you might have seen the people rowing. And in a rowing race, let's say we have two teams that are rowing. You might remember for the Olympics that rowers face backwards, so they're going in this direction, but they face this way to make the rowing work. And they're on side-by-side stretches of water, and they're racing. And so the gun goes off, and both teams row like crazy. And after a while, Team A has crossed the finish line and achieved their conservation outcome. Team B is way back here and hasn't gotten very far. And so I'm going to ask you, which team has been more effective? And obviously, Team A should get the gold medal because they've been achieving their conservation outcome. Whereas Team B is not, and we should say that they should be talked to or they should get some additional support because obviously they're not doing very well. But if I gave you the additional piece of information that Team A had a current of enabling conditions that was pushing them along, and they just had to sit there and they drifted over the finish line, whereas Team B has been rowing like crazy in the face of a huge current of threats working against them, and then I asked you which team has been more effective, the answer might be a little bit different. And so what this teaches us is, yes, we do have to get to our ultimate outcome, but we also have to understand the context in which we're working, and we have to give teams credit for achieving shorter term process objectives en route to this. Because I will tell you, most protected areas are more like this situation where you have huge threats than this situation where everything is easy. So we have to support team for meeting their process objectives. So in order to think about effectiveness, what we realized is that it's only in relation to the objectives or outcomes or goals that the team is setting for itself. So at the start of the process, the team has to set the bar for their goal of what they need to achieve in order for those values to be conserved. So the bar represents the threshold for a given objective or outcome. Specifying the height of the bar must be determined by the area network managers during the planning process. And it represents what they're hoping to achieve to reach desired effectiveness. So we can't even talk about effectiveness unless we have that bar set. Now you can cheat and set the bar too low, but then it's not credible. At the same time, you also don't want to set the bar too high, because then you're just setting yourself up for failure. And so in this case, for example, if we're trying to say one of our threats is sea level rise or climate change, if you as a management team say that success is only if we can stop the sea level rise, then you're setting the bar way too high for yourself, because nobody's going to be able to stop that. And so maybe you need to adjust the bar to say, we need to be able to respond to sea level rise or deal with the implications of sea level rise in the context of our protected area. So we have to find the right place and way of setting the bar. So that bar has to be results oriented, high enough to matter, and achievable, low enough to be feasible. But it also has to be specific, measurable, and time limited so that it can be easily assessed. So this is why we think about SMART objectives or outcomes, because we're really setting the bar against which we can measure effectiveness. And that's the same objective that I showed you back in that theory of change from the conservation standards, which is really a good reminder that it's not really one bar that we're trying to cross, but it's a set of hurdles along a theory of change that the team has to cross. So that to get to effectiveness, we have to go through governance and planning, good strategies being implemented, threat reduction, and the values conserved. So it's really a theory of change, a set of hurdles that we're setting the bar on that we have to get to. So we need to demonstrate that our management processes are leading to outcomes. A good approach also has to balance feasibility, usefulness, and credibility. And so what do we mean by these? So if we go back to the original theory of change, at the end, we wanted PAs and OECMs to have public, credible, current, and useful outcome-based effectiveness assessments. If we do that, managers will use the assessments to improve their practices. They'll get the support and tech capacity they need, and then we'll have more effective systems. But we also want to be able to track commitments, and we want to have broader society having confidence in our PAs and OECMs so that they provide the support. If you believe this as the outcome of what we're trying to achieve, then it has to be feasible to apply globally. It has to be useful to managers, but it also has to be credible supporters. So whatever we need to do needs to meet those three criteria. If we look at how we look at and how various tools are used to assess effectiveness, you can do a first-party assessment where PA and OECM and system managers vouch for both the credibility of objectives and outcomes and whether they're achieved. You can do a second-party assessment where there's a peer review of the credibility of objectives and outcomes, or you can do an independent third-party assessment to see whether they're achieved, ideally by different parties. So there's sort of three different levels of intensity of the assessments of both the credibility of the objectives and then whether they're being accomplished. If we think about the service sector, there is this idea of the iron triangle of service delivery. So that if I'm ordering a piece of software or I want to get some furniture, I can get it good and fast, but then it's going to be expensive. I can get it fast and cheap, but then it's going to be low quality. Or I can get it cheap and good, but then it's going to take a long time to get to me. So you only, in the service world, only get 2 of these 3 things. It's impossible to be cheap, good, and fast. So the question when we come to effectiveness assessments is, we want it to be useful, we want it to be feasible, and we want it to be credible. If we do a third-party theory of change-based assessment, that's useful and credible, but it takes a lot of time and treasure and resources to do that, so it may not be very feasible. If we do a non-theory of change-based approach, yeah, we just do a quick checklist. It may be feasible and credible, but it's not really that useful to managers. If we do a first-party theory of change, so we have the managers do it themselves, it could be feasible and useful, but then it's not credible. And the question is that middle impossible, or are there things that we could do with second-party theories of change or ways of thinking about this that might be more effective? That's part of what we're exploring. So the last principle is that we want a good effectiveness approach to be useful to and thus used by protected and conserved areas and their system managers. As you'll see, we want this to come from real world experience. My colleague Paola and Mariano and others have been involved in a group of protected areas that are really trying to think through this and build on their systems. They've been doing it for a long time, and they've been coming up with reports that work for them. And what we want to have is a system that fits and meets the needs of these organizations and agencies as they go through their work. So these are the 6 principles for assessing PA and OECM effectiveness that our task force has come up with. What we've done is then, having agreed on the principles and framework, we then tried to develop a consensus framework and approach, and I want to show you what that framework looks like. And this has really been adapted from what the Peruvians developed. So this is all credit to the Peruvians for developing this framework and this model. But basically, for a given protected area or OECM area, we want to think about good governance, sound design, and enabling conditions. That leads to adaptive strategy implementation. That leads to threats being reduced. That leads to areas and values being conserved and human well-being being enhanced. And that is a monitoring and evaluation and learning component to this as well. So that we think that in order for good effectiveness to happen, all of these results need to happen. And it's not just independently of each other, but we have to be able to show how they're linked to each other, that the arrows are really important, showing those connections between those different things. Once we do that, that is both the management and the outcomes that we're tracking, and there's a little bit of overlap here. This is at the PA or OECM area. We can then also look at the system level. At the system level, you're going through the same governance, design, enabling conditions, and adaptive strategy implementation. But in this case, the strategies at the system level lead to the individual PAs or OECMs being set up. That leads to the individual PA or OECM area outcomes being achieved. That then leads to the system values being conserved. So there's a loop through here, back up to here. And then there's also a question of whether at the national or provincial level, there's also stuff happening directly to do threat reduction. And then all this sits in the context of global support. So this is our framework of how to think about effectiveness and tracking whether these things are happening over time. When we did that review in the Rosetta Stone of all the existing frameworks and tools, like the MET, like IMET, like the Green List, all those different tools that are out there, they're all pretty good at talking about governance and sound design and enabling conditions. So they really track that pretty well. And we don't need to spend a lot of time thinking about that. When it comes to strategy implementation, it's a little bit more mixed. And then where most of these frameworks are having issues is how they practically and usefully track outcomes and do the monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So these are the areas where there's gaps in these tools and frameworks, and we think we can add some value to what they're doing. So our approach is to crosswalk the existing tools to report on process. So when it comes to process, we can take the MET scores or the Green List scores, and those are fine, and people can rate whether those results have been achieved using those scores, building on that information, or they could do it themselves if they haven't done a MET, but we're really kind of taking those existing assessments. And we can rate these things in terms of being, are the results achieved, on track, partially achieved, not achieved, which creates a universal scoring that allows us to bring together the information from those different tools. When it comes to adaptive strategy implementation, our approach is borrowing from the conservation standards, and it's exploring common protected area management strategies, 5 of them in particular, where we can develop the theory of change. Like, for example, for enforcement, do we have good enforcement plans? Are needed staff trained and deployed? Is enforcement equitably implemented? Are potential poachers deterred? Are legal threat activities reduced? And is that leading to conservation values being enhanced? So we can develop these standard theories of change for the 5 most common strategies used by protected areas. And then we can rate progress against whichever are relevant, or people can develop their own theories of change for additional strategies. And then for outcomes, we're again drawing on tools from the conservation standards to think about the levels of threats for the protected area. So the different values within it, what's their threat level? What was their initial status? What was the desired status? What's the current status of the threats? And then what's the trend? And then has the outcome been achieved? So we can do threshold-based assessments of threats and the status of things as well. So this was not the threats. This was actually the status of them, but it's the same for threats as well. So basically, we are developing this consensus framework and approach. And what our task force is now doing is pilot testing this with key protected area and OECM systems. So we're doing a combination of expert desk reviews, where we work with protected and M&E specialists to review and comment on the components of our framework. Alpha user tests, where we test it in a facilitated workshop setting. And eventually we want to get to beta user tests, where we're testing it in a more live setting. And that beta user test will require translating the framework to actual tools and guidance that can be used by practitioners. So we've mostly completed our desk reviews, working with the Red Parkas group, which Mariana will talk more about in a bit, with Parks Canada and the Canadian Wildlife Service, with the Conservation Measures Partnership, with FOS staff, and with our task force. And so we've had a whole bunch of experts go through and talk about and rank the different principles and results that we're having, whether they make sense. We're now working and planning our alpha tests, which are a set of 5 to 6 sessions where we work with a protected area system and go through the governance, the strategy implementation, the focal values, the threats, and then discuss and see whether things are working. We've doing that with Red Parkas again. We just completed one with Chile, and we're talking about other groups about doing this as well. We would love to talk to you if you're interested in testing this. So finally, our proposed theory of change is that we pilot test with the key systems. We've accomplished this. We've accomplished this. We feel like this result has been achieved. We've accomplished this framework, and now we're in this testing, and then we'll sort of see whether the rest of this theory of change holds as we take it forward. So in this talk, I've given you a history of the Conservation Measures Partnership and how they think about a way of doing, looking at adaptively managing conservation projects. I've given you a history of what this WCPA task force has been doing, trying to think about effectiveness assessments for protected area systems, drawing on tools and lessons from the partnership, with the idea being if the effectiveness assessment fits within the ongoing management that's being done, then both are more likely to be done and be useful. We're very lucky now that we have Mariano and also Paula, who are working with the Red Parkas group and with Chile, who kind of sit in the middle. They're both familiar with the Conservation Measures Partnership, but they're also familiar with what the WCPA task force has been doing. And so I think we're really lucky to have them explain how they've tried to put these two pieces together, because they're already at the top of the mountain and know what they're doing. So I'm going to pause there. If you have questions for us or want to join our task force, you can reach my colleague Paula at paula@fosonline.org. Let me pause briefly there to see if there's any immediate questions, and then we'll turn it over to Mariano to talk about the specific Chilean case.
Nick, yes, we have 2 questions.
Okay, let me see if I can get, okay.
Yes, so one is about the Rosetta Stone. It's coming from Shakira. She has worked with IUCN Bangladesh. So the question is, how does the Rosetta Stone framework confirms the local indicators are captured into the global level assessment tools?
That's a very good question. Thank you. I'll show you briefly this Rosetta Stone. So here is the Rosetta Stone. We're happy to share this with people. This is the first page with the frameworks and tools in their original order. So you can see the Green List, IBEX, MET4, MEPCA, Open Standards, RAPAM. Here's a meta study that Leverington did a few years ago, WCPA, KBAs, Social Practice, OSPAR. It goes on and on and on. As we get over here, we have some of the specific country frameworks that have been developed. Our Rosetta Stone, unfortunately, we did not have the time to go to every country in the world and put their framework in here, but you could. And so I think one way to handle the local things would be to take your own country's framework and compare it to what's in here, or to the crosswalk where the things are scrambled and put on each other's order, and you could actually see whether they make sense. So we've tried to draw on as many as we could, but I think we could always add more, or it would be a tool for you to compare the tool you're using or the framework you're using with what the rest of the world knows. Hopefully that
And
answers.
if you want, yes, and if you want to share those tools with us, please do that. We will be happy to add them.
Okay. What's
And
the
we have
next?
another question. Yes, well, this question, I'm not sure if we are going to answer this question, but it's how we ensure the enforcement efforts is sustainable when we have resources and staffing that are limited.
So that is a big question. I think that what these application of these effectiveness assessments, and especially the theories of change that I showed you, what that might help you do is understand where is your enforcement breaking down. So if you take a theory of change approach, so let's go back to, for example, oops, wrong presentation. If we go back to this example here, and we look at this theory of change in this case here. So the question is, you're not seeing the poachers being deterred. The question would be why? Is it because we didn't set up a good plan? No, check, we got the plan. Oh, maybe we don't have enough staff. So the needed staff aren't trained and deployed. And you might see a red mark here that shows you didn't achieve this result. So maybe that's where the problem is. And then at that point, all you can do as a manager is go to your bosses and say, hey, I have evidence that we don't have enough staff to stop the poachers. So we're going to need some more resources and more staff to be able to train them. Or maybe our staff doesn't have the jeeps or the cars they need to go out and do the patrols. So at least you can pinpoint the problem. Now, if your bosses come back to you and say, sorry, there's no money, we can't buy you any jeeps, well, then you're going to have to figure out a way to do it, maybe using horses or some other way of getting out there. Or at least you'll have to talk to your boss and say, well, then we can't save the animal being poached because we don't have the resources. So the standards aren't going to solve the problem for you, but hopefully they help you identify the problem and help you argue for what the solution needs to be. Any other urgent questions, Paul, or should we let Mariano present?
Yes, yes, we have 2 more questions, but we don't have a lot of time to.
Okay, why don't we hold those questions? Well, let's maybe Mariano will answer them, and if not, we'll come back to them at the end. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to pass it to Mariano, who works in Chile, and he's going to talk about their experience using these work. And I believe, Mariano, you're going to be speaking in Espanol. So for those of us who want the translation in English, we have to be on the English channel.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Muchas gracias. Bueno, primero agradecer la invitación. No sé si ven mi pantalla, ¿cierto? You see my screen? Ok, thank you. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Efectivamente, desde Chile hemos participado en las instancias que comentaba Nick respecto de pensar lo que significa la efectividad de la gestión de áreas protegidas. Es un tema que hace mucho rato estamos trabajando en nuestro país y un poco les voy a contar nuestra experiencia desarrollando el modelo teórico y apoyando el trabajo que se está haciendo y que está trabajando Nick, y también cómo hemos ido aplicando este modelo teórico ya en la gestión de las áreas protegidas y cómo eso nos ha llevado también a tener marcos de gestión efectiva que nos permita certificar algunas áreas protegidas. Para comenzar, obviamente les quiero contar que yo represento al Sistema Nacional de Áreas Protegidas del Estado de Chile. El Estado de Chile cuenta con 109 áreas protegidas actualmente. con una alta diversidad de ecosistemas, del norte, altiplano, desierto, bosques templados, maritorio, entre otros ecosistemas que están representados dentro de las áreas protegidas de Chile. Pero como les decía, yo les voy a contar cuál ha sido el proceso desde Chile, de cómo hemos ido entendiendo lo que significa el manejo efectivo, cómo lo hemos ido aplicando y cómo eso nos permite con el tiempo lograr una efectividad en la gestión de algunas de las áreas protegidas del sistema. Para comenzar, lo que nosotros nos hemos preguntado hace mucho tiempo, que es parte también de estas preguntas que se plantea Nick, ¿qué significa la conservación y la gestión efectiva de áreas protegidas? ¿Cómo podemos tener un entendimiento común? Porque históricamente nosotros hemos utilizado distintas herramientas, MED, lista verde, hemos utilizado herramientas internas incluso que hemos desarrollado en Chile para medir la efectividad, y siempre nos damos cuenta de que esta efectividad o sirve para contar, simplemente para entregar un número, y por lo general no sirve para la gestión del día a día de las áreas protegidas de los guardaparques que trabajan en los territorios. Y eso es precisamente lo que nosotros queríamos abordar, esa dificultad, y hace algunos años nosotros desarrollamos un modelo conceptual de lo que significaba la gestión, cómo debiera ser la gestión de las áreas protegidas de Chile, incorporando indicadores de proceso, de resultados y de impacto, siempre pensando en que teníamos que llegar a los niveles también de resultados y de impacto y no solo quedarnos en los procesos en los que estábamos siempre estancados en la gestión de la área protegida, simplemente contando lo que hacíamos, pero queríamos pasar a contar lo que estábamos logrando en reducción de amenazas, en conservación de objetos de conservación, en bienestar de las comunidades locales, en bienestar humano. Y este es el modelo que creamos hace algún tiempo como parte de un trabajo de reporte de gestión, de áreas protegidas, para poder implementar una evaluación de cómo estaba avanzando la gestión en algunas áreas protegidas. La base de este proceso, obviamente Nick ya la comentó a grandes rasgos, pero era siempre focalizarse en 3 grandes áreas de trabajo: en la implementación de estrategias o los procesos que se están desarrollando en la gestión, pero también en lograr los resultados que esperábamos lograr, en reducción de amenazas, en distintos resultados intermedios, pero también en lograr los impactos deseados en cuanto a objetos de conservación, biodiversidad, bienestar humano, objetos culturales también, diversidad cultural. Esta es la lógica que siempre nos guió para poder identificar qué era la gestión efectiva de las áreas protegidas en Chile. Por supuesto, para lograr ello, teníamos que evaluar si es que se estaban logrando los resultados de los impactos a través del monitoreo de resultados y de impacto, no solamente para contar cómo nos estaba yendo, sino también para ajustar en la gestión cuando viéramos que no tenía un impacto deseado, que no estábamos logrando los resultados deseados, y ajustarlo precisamente para volver a comenzar el ciclo a través de un proceso de manejo adaptativo, cosa de poder mejorar las estrategias y así lograr los resultados que estábamos esperando. Pero no bastaba solamente con hacerse cargo de estos 3 ámbitos, de la implementación de estrategias, los resultados y el impacto, porque, como dijo Nick también, hay factores habilitantes o condiciones habilitantes que son clave para entender por qué podemos implementar acciones o por qué podemos lograr los resultados y los impactos que deseamos. Obviamente, el buen diseño del área protegida, la buena gobernanza del área protegida, un plan de manejo adecuado, el financiamiento adecuado y sostenible del área protegida, el personal suficiente y capacitado técnicamente y la infraestructura y equipamiento técnico son clave para la gestión. ¿Por qué? Porque, por ejemplo, si no tenemos un buen diseño del área protegida, si el área protegida es muy pequeña para conservar su diversidad biológica, es muy poco probable que logremos los impactos deseados. Muy poco probable que logremos conservar realmente poblaciones viables si es que el área protegida no tuvo un buen diseño. En caso de que no tengamos una buena gobernanza, esto puede afectar, por supuesto, la implementación de estrategias de conservación. Eso muy probablemente va a afectar el logro de resultados. No vamos a generar conflictos, vamos a estar en constantes conflictos con comunidades locales y por lo tanto no vamos a poder implementar de buena forma estrategias, lograr resultados e impactos de acuerdo a lo deseado. En el caso de que no tengamos un plan de manejo, obviamente no, ¿qué estrategias vamos a implementar si no tenemos un plan de trabajo asociado? Y por supuesto, si no tenemos un plan adecuado, una buena planificación y un plan de trabajo de mediano plazo, es muy difícil saber si estamos logrando los resultados y probablemente por eso tampoco no estemos logrando los resultados y el impacto que deseamos. Lo mismo, todos probablemente saben, y es parte de las preguntas que señalaban delante, si no tenemos un financiamiento sostenible, si tenemos falta de financiamiento, es muy poco probable poder implementar buenas estrategias de conservación y por lo tanto poco probable lograr resultados en la reducción de amenazas, por ejemplo, y por supuesto impactos en la conservación de la biodiversidad o de la diversidad cultural. Lo mismo si no tenemos personal capacitado, muy difícil poder implementar estrategias adecuadas de conservación si es que el personal no hay personal para hacerlo o el personal que existe no está capacitado para ello. Y finalmente, también necesitamos estos equipamientos, como decía Nick, los jeep, los medios de transporte, pero también la infraestructura, los GPS, las cámaras trampa, todo tipo de infraestructura y equipamiento que necesitamos para implementar las estrategias de conservación, pero también para poder evaluar si estamos logrando resultados e impactos dentro de la gestión. Esto es, por lo tanto, el marco de base para poder entender qué es la gestión efectiva, la gestión y conservación efectiva. Se centra en implementar estrategias, lograr resultados y lograr impacto de conservación, pero entendiendo que para ello se requieren condiciones habilitantes que si no están dadas, también de alguna forma explican algunos de estos componentes de los que estábamos hablando. Y por supuesto, en la forma de evaluar la efectividad era, antiguamente lo que usábamos mucho era en términos de porcentaje de efectividad. Si teníamos todos los factores habilitantes, por ejemplo, logrados, estábamos implementando las estrategias, pero no estábamos logrando los resultados o el impacto, o no sabíamos si lo estábamos logrando, el cálculo simplemente era, ok, tenemos 7 componentes, ok, y solamente 2 componentes no lo tenemos, ok. Por lo tanto, podríamos hablar de un 78% de efectividad en este caso, siendo que realmente no estamos logrando nada de lo que pensábamos lograr en términos de resultados e impacto, y eso para nosotros nos hizo mucho sentido de que la evaluación de efectividad no es solamente un número, no puede ser solamente un número, porque los números pueden llegar a engañar, podemos llegar a tener altos niveles de efectividad a nivel numérico, pero si nos vamos al área protegida y los resultados, podríamos realmente no estar logrando lo que pensábamos que con esos números íbamos a lograr. Y en base a todo este contexto en el cual trabajamos en conjunto con colegas de muchos países de Latinoamérica en el grupo Red Parques de gestión efectiva, precisamente para entender esta lógica de cómo ponernos de acuerdo en qué es lo que significa la gestión y conservación efectiva y poner criterios para ello, criterios como, por ejemplo, que la evaluación de efectividad tiene que medir el éxito en el manejo de las áreas protegidas y del sistema. Siempre hay que pensar en estos dos niveles. Del área protegida es súper importante para el manejo adaptativo local, pero también tenemos que dar cuenta a nivel de sistema para ver cómo mejoramos a nivel de sistema. Un criterio clave es que tiene que ser útil para el área protegida, una evaluación de efectividad que solamente sea útil para mostrar a instancias internacionales o a instancias nacionales y que no pueda ser utilizado por el área protegida para mejorar, no es un buen elemento, no es una buena herramienta para la evaluación de efectividad. Tiene que ser útil para el área protegida, para tomar decisiones en base a los resultados y para hacer manejo adaptativo, para mejorar, por lo tanto. Y por lo tanto el foco tiene que estar dado en la mejora de la gestión y no solamente en el mostrar, no solamente en el entregar un valor de efectividad, sino que realmente en mejorar la gestión. Independiente de cuál sea el nivel de gestión de una área protegida, siempre hay brechas, siempre hay aspectos de los que hay que mejorar y un buen sistema de evaluación de efectividad tiene que poder mostrar esos componentes donde hay brechas, donde tenemos que mejorar y asimismo tiene que permitir identificarlo y que el equipo pueda adaptar la gestión para mejorar. Y por lo tanto, como criterio final, tiene que incluir la vinculación entre estas condiciones habilitantes que hablábamos y las estrategias con los resultados y con el impacto. No puede medir tampoco cada componente por sí solo, no puedo, cuando evalúo los resultados, no tener a la vista cuáles fueron las estrategias que implementé, porque cada resultado depende de una estrategia de gestión, por lo tanto, tiene que estar a la vista, tiene que permitir vincular las estrategias y las condiciones habilitantes con los resultados y el impacto. ¿Por qué? Precisamente para poder tomar medidas como la que decía Nick. Si no estoy logrando los resultados, tengo que poder entender si es que es porque no estoy implementando la estrategia, si es que es porque no tengo presupuestos, si es porque no tengo una buena planificación, si es porque el área protegida no está bien diseñada. Esto siempre es importante mantenerlo presente. Y eso es parte entonces de este trabajo que se ha desarrollado como parte del grupo de Red Parques para entender la lógica de cómo debiera ser un proceso de evaluación de efectividad de áreas protegidas. Y así es como dentro del grupo estuvimos probando, gracias al trabajo del grupo Red Parques, en este marco, en este modelo global de efectividad inicial, donde en base a distintas reuniones pudimos ir afinando algunos conceptos, ir afinando algunos elementos y ponernos de acuerdo en cuáles eran los componentes clave, cómo se vinculaba también este marco con otras instancias, y eso es un poco lo que desarrollamos en estos procesos con el grupo Red Parques. Y es donde entonces parte del aporte de esas reuniones que pudimos lograr entonces en el marco del grupo de trabajo de la Task Force de la OICN y de la WSPA, este marco global de evaluación de efectividad en la gestión y conservación de áreas protegidas, con los componentes que son la buena gobernanza, el buen diseño y planificación, las condiciones habilitantes, la buena implementación de estrategias, la reducción de amenazas, para lograr objetos de conservación o valores bien conservados y desarrollar también y promover el bienestar humano, a través de un monitoreo, evaluación y aprendizaje que nos permita el manejo adaptativo. O sea, eso es clave para dar cuenta de esos criterios que nos permitan la vinculación entre componentes y aprender de la gestión, no solamente mostrar un resultado. Entonces, ¿pero cómo hacemos para, una vez teniendo claro de cuál es el modelo conceptual, qué significa la evaluación de efectividad, tenemos claridad cómo debiera ser, pero cómo lo implementamos en las áreas protegidas? Y ahí entra otra herramienta que también hablaba Nick, que es una metodología que habla de hacerse cargo precisamente, voy a volver a la lámina anterior, cómo nos hacemos cargo de que cada uno de estos componentes irlos fortaleciendo. No basta simplemente con mostrar y evaluar, sino que ir fortaleciendo cada uno en base a las brechas que nosotros vamos identificando. Y ahí es donde nosotros fuimos identificando las brechas que teníamos en nuestro sistema. Nosotros hace algunos años recién comenzamos a focalizar un trabajo fuerte en la buena gobernanza, gracias a entender que esta buena gobernanza era un factor condicionante de una buena gestión. Se generaron instancias o documentos de nivel nacional donde se instauraron procesos de buena gobernanza y de participación de comunidades locales asociadas a la gestión de áreas protegidas. Se incorporaron procesos de planificación participativa a la gestión de la área protegida, se fortalecieron los consejos consultivos de áreas protegidas, y de esta forma entonces podemos ir viendo cómo cada área protegida va mejorando en su modelo de gobernanza, pero también como a nivel de sistema vamos generando las condiciones habilitantes para que las áreas protegidas puedan incorporar una buena gobernanza dentro de su gestión. Y un paso clave para nosotros fue también asociado a la planificación, el uso de la adaptación de la metodología de los estándares de conservación a la planificación del área protegida de Chile. Nosotros tomamos la base de los estándares de conservación, adaptamos algunos aspectos en base a nuestro lenguaje y elaboramos un manual para la planificación basado en los estándares de conservación, que nos ha permitido fortalecer la planificación. Fortalecer la planificación en cuanto a que ahora la planificación realmente plantea objetivos claros, plantea metas claras, plantea estrategias de gestión que son bastante claras, plantea cuáles son las necesidades, cuáles son las brechas, cuáles son la identificación de amenazas, de objetos de observación, de elementos de bienestar humano. Entonces, el adoptar la metodología de planificación de los estándares de conservación nos permitió también abordar muchos conceptos que son necesarios para lograr precisamente este avance en la gestión, entendiendo cuáles son las áreas donde hay que mejorar y tener una planificación estandarizada. Lo mismo en la implementación de estrategias. La implementación de estrategias para nosotros en Chile son estrategias de 3 ámbitos distintos. Estrategias de conservación de la biodiversidad o de la reducción de amenazas a la biodiversidad, donde enfocamos un trabajo importante, donde se están analizando y evaluando estas estrategias de conservación, pero también estrategias asociadas al uso público y al turismo de las áreas protegidas, que también son relevantes no solamente para generar bienestar humano o proveer satisfacción a los visitantes, sino también para evitar algunas amenazas a la biodiversidad asociadas al turismo. Y también estrategias vinculadas directamente a la participación de las comunidades y al bienestar de las comunidades. Por lo tanto, son focos distintos, pero son estrategias que son clave, que nosotros teníamos que abordar y que hemos ido fortaleciendo para realmente hacernos cargo de no simplemente hacer gestión en base a lo que siempre hemos hecho, sino que realmente identificar y planificar cuáles son las estrategias necesarias y qué es lo que queremos lograr con cada una de esas estrategias. Y un paso muy importante también ha sido el fortalecimiento de un aspecto que es clave para el manejo adaptativo, que es el monitoreo, la evaluación y el aprendizaje, pero a través precisamente de identificar y diseñar algunas metodologías específicas para monitorear que fueran útiles para la gestión, para tomar decisiones, que nos dieran resultados claros, pero que fueran factibles de implementar, que un poco en base a lo que decía Nick, siempre hay que hacer este análisis de qué es lo que me entrega mejor información, pero también pensando que es factible, considerando los presupuestos, considerando el personal, las capacidades, y ahí es donde se ha ido fortaleciendo 4 grandes ámbitos de monitoreo dentro del Sistema Nacional de Áreas Protegidas de Chile. El primero, probablemente el más emblemático que tenemos en Chile, es el programa de fotomonitoreo con cámaras trampa, que es probablemente el programa de monitoreo con cámaras trampa más grande que existe en el mundo en sistemas de áreas protegidas. Tenemos más de 30 áreas protegidas en el país con un sistema implementado de fotomonitoreo estándar, que después les puedo compartir el link a la plataforma de fotomonitoreo donde pueden revisarse todas las informaciones para monitorear tanto amenazas a la biodiversidad como también objetos de conservación o valores de conservación. Otro aspecto, otro ámbito o metodología de monitoreo que se ha ido fortaleciendo es el monitoreo remoto a través de imágenes satelitales, pero también a través de drones, donde hemos podido ir fortaleciendo el monitoreo de ecosistemas, de ecosistemas forestales principalmente, pero también de humedales y algunas condiciones de sequía también, etcétera, donde nos ha ido entregando información para la toma de decisiones y mejorar las estrategias de conservación. El monitoreo de humedales específicamente, tanto a nivel con drones o imágenes, pero también a nivel local, midiendo la calidad de agua, fortaleciendo algunos elementos para realmente hacernos cargo de cuáles son las condiciones en que están los distintos humedales del sistema de áreas protegidas. También es una metodología que hemos ido fortaleciendo y que ya está implementada en varias de las áreas protegidas del país. Y finalmente, una metodología que ya estamos usando y que estamos tratando de fortalecer, porque nos parece que cumple un rol fundamental, principalmente para hacerse cargo de ir identificando los resultados intermedios que tenemos dentro de la gestión. Tiene que ver con el sistema SMART de patrullaje, que esta tecnología que nos permite ir focalizando los esfuerzos de patrullaje, de fiscalización en las áreas protegidas y utilizar todo ese valor que tiene el personal guardaparque de áreas protegidas y que no se pierda esa información, sino que realmente se vaya insumando en un proceso de información que nos permita tomar decisiones respecto de dónde están las amenazas principales, cuáles son las principales conductas de las personas que están generando algún impacto, etc. Entonces, este proceso de fortalecimiento de las metodologías de monitoreo ha sido fundamental en este paso para poder implementar este marco teórico que es realmente medir la efectividad. Si no tuviéramos monitoreo o no hubiésemos fortalecido el monitoreo en estos ámbitos, es muy difícil saber si estamos siendo efectivos o no. Y ya como para ir finalizando, el tercer punto es cómo este modelo, cómo el entendimiento de este marco teórico de lo que significa la efectividad de la gestión y de la conservación, junto con la metodología de los estándares de conservación, del fortalecimiento del monitoreo, del fortalecimiento de la gobernanza, cómo me ayuda a lograr objetivos ya no a nivel del área protegida, sino objetivos del sistema, objetivos como que haya más áreas protegidas que cumplan con los criterios de lista verde y puedan ser certificadas como áreas protegidas de gestión efectiva por lista verde, o que cumplan con las metas globales de efectividad de gestión. Y precisamente el poder entender de forma conjunta lo que significa la gestión efectiva nos ha permitido también hacer el vínculo entre este marco teórico y el marco teórico metodológico de los estándares de conservación, que tiene mucha similitud en conceptos, en cómo se piensa a través de una teoría del cambio, pero también con lista verde donde incluso los conceptos se repiten, de buena gobernanza, de buena planificación y diseño, de manejo efectivo, de resultados de conservación. Cómo a través de entender y tener una lógica de juntar un marco global, una metodología de planificación y implementación de estrategias, podemos llegar a tener una visualización mejor de que las áreas protegidas realmente están en un nivel alto de gestión. Nos hemos dado cuenta que es muy útil, que nos permite, y así es como hoy en día tenemos 3 áreas protegidas en Chile que son candidatas a lista verde, que son candidatas que están trabajando con este marco conceptual, que están implementando los estándares de conservación, pero si bien son solamente 3 áreas protegidas que están trabajando con lista verde, todas las áreas protegidas del Estado en Chile, a pesar de que quizás tengan un nivel, algunas todavía de gestión básico, están avanzando en mejorar la gestión y están avanzando en base a este entendimiento de cuáles son las líneas base para tener una gestión efectiva. La buena gobernanza, la planificación, las condiciones habilitantes, la estrategia, el logro de resultados y de impacto. Con este entendimiento estamos en todas las áreas protegidas del sistema de áreas protegidas mejorando cada uno de esos ámbitos, tanto a nivel local como a nivel de sistema, y por lo tanto el uso de este marco global de efectividad, el uso de los estándares de conservación, nosotros al menos lo reconocemos como un proceso que nos permite fortalecer el manejo de la área protegida, nos permite evaluar su efectividad, ver cómo estamos, en base a esa evaluación no solamente tenerlo como un número, sino realmente hacer manejo adaptativo y finalmente poder verificar a través de un estándar como el de la lista verde que llegamos en algún momento a un nivel de gestión satisfactorio o ideal y que por lo tanto ya cumplimos con todos esos componentes que el modelo o que el marco global no solicita. Y nosotros lo que hicimos para mostrar cómo se vinculan tanto la lista verde como el marco global a las áreas protegidas, hicimos un caso de estudio en el Parque Nacional Cerro Castillo, que está postulando a lista verde actualmente, y que precisamente ha ido fortaleciendo su metodología de gobernanza a través de la creación de un consejo consultivo, tiene un plan de manejo actualizado con estándares de conservación, con un buen diseño, está implementando estrategias de conservación de distinto tipo, está monitoreando y evaluando sus resultados, tiene programa de monitoreo con cámaras trampa, tiene programa de monitoreo con SMART, de patrullaje, tiene monitoreo satelital, lo mismo con los objetos de conservación, y por lo tanto está implementando en este momento un manejo adaptativo en base a una buena planificación, a una medición de los resultados y del impacto, y fortaleciendo cada uno de los ámbitos por sí mismo y también, por supuesto, el proceso de gestión del área protegida. Y finalmente, también hicimos el ejercicio de evaluar este mismo Parque Nacional, su efectividad a través de este marco global, a través del marco teórico, que nos permitió entender que también este marco teórico nos permite no solamente evaluar y ponerle un número a la efectividad, sino realmente ir visualizando cuáles son los aspectos donde hay que mejorar. Cómo hemos ido mejorando en el tiempo, pero además cuáles son los aspectos que hay que mejorar, qué acciones hay que tomar para poder mejorar la gestión. Y eso es clave para hacer este vínculo entre un marco de de evaluación de efectividad que solamente muestre un número o una valoración, y un marco de efectividad que nos permita realmente tomar decisiones para hacer manejo adaptativo. Y por lo tanto, nuestra visión es que la clave es tener un modelo global común que podamos entender en conjunto lo que significa la gestión efectiva y la conservación efectiva. Me parece que este marco global lo hace de esta forma. Tener una metodología que ayude a implementar este marco global. No sacamos nada con tener un marco global si es que no realmente no le damos carne en los territorios con una metodología de planificación, de evaluación, de teoría del cambio, y para eso los estándares de conservación son clave. Y de esa forma podemos ir apuntando a que las áreas protegidas cumplan con estándares internacionales que puedan certificarse por lista verde, que puedan cumplir con el marco global de conservación de diversidad biológica. Ese es nuestro foco, fortalecer cada uno de estos ámbitos, trabajar con la metodología y lograr que cada vez más áreas protegidas se certifiquen o entren en el proceso de certificación con lista verde para lograr una efectividad de gestión y conservación. Muchas gracias y quedo atento a cualquier consulta.
Thank you, Mariano, for that very informative presentation. That concludes the presentation part of this. So we are floor open for questions and discussion.
And there was a question in the chat box for Mariano. So Mariano, the question was, I'm just wondering how Chile is achieving conservation goals, ensuring local people's development. And then what are the key steps in the strategy planning?
Sí, muchas gracias por la pregunta. A ver, un poco como lo comentaba, nosotros el primer paso que dimos como país en el sistema de áreas protegidas es entender lo que significa la gestión efectiva y tener un marco teórico para eso. De que las estrategias no son simplemente acciones que se implementan año a año, sino que cada estrategia tiene que ser parte de un proceso de planificación. No simplemente hacer acciones, sino que cada acción que se realiza en una área protegida tiene que ser parte de un proceso de planificación de a qué amenaza está apuntando esa estrategia, cuáles son los factores que generan esas amenazas, por lo tanto identificar de muy buena forma, hacer una buena planificación de cada estrategia. Eso se da por el fortalecimiento de los planes de manejo que estamos desarrollando a través de esta nueva metodología, pero también, como no podemos avanzar tan rápido en los planes de manejo, también cada área protegida, en toda la área protegida del país, están implementando procesos breves de planificación anual para identificar qué estrategias son clave y prioritarias de implementar y también evaluar esas estrategias en el tiempo. Y eso se vincula también con, para poder evaluar si nos está yendo bien, tenemos que implementar estos programas de monitoreo, por lo tanto estamos fortaleciendo el monitoreo en cámaras trampa, monitoreo satelital, precisamente para ver si es que, por ejemplo, en un área protegida una amenaza como los perros está aumentando o no, y si eso se debe o no a lo que hicimos nosotros como estrategia. Eso es el formato que nosotros, no basta con hacerse cargo de un solo componente, no tiene que entender toda la lógica y cómo cada componente se vincula con otro. Hoy en día, obviamente tenemos todavía brechas importantes, pero las conocemos. Gracias a este marco conceptual sabemos cuáles son las brechas, dónde tenemos que ir fortaleciendo el ámbito de la gestión, y de esa forma podemos ir avanzando en acortar las brechas y lograr eventualmente que todas las áreas protegidas vayan haciendo una gestión efectiva. No sé si había una segunda consulta, no sé si no respondí.
Maybe we'll let that one go. Paula, I'm going to go back to a question that Felipe asked a while back, but I think it's a really important question. So Felipe asked, how does this framework apply to sustainable use protected areas and indigenous community managed conservation areas? And can their local communities be involved and then contribute to the assessment? So one of the things from the conservation standards that I showed was that process called healthy country planning. And healthy country planning, again, was pioneered in Australia, working with Aboriginal land managers. There's now been spread to First Nations in Canada and to parts of Latin America as well. And I think what their lesson has been that is if you put these kinds of systems in the right framework and language, and you do it present it to people in a way that is culturally appropriate, it can be a very rich and powerful discussion, and people can use these tools and principles to manage their traditional territories or lands. And I think it's also showed that it can incorporate and braid together all kinds of evidence and knowledge so that you can combine scientific knowledge with traditional ways of knowing. And so I think there's actually a fair amount of experience that these are very powerful tools to work with and empower indigenous communities, local communities to do their management and their work. And we can share some examples of that if that would be helpful.
Thank you. And there is also one question asking, so there's, I think there are two parts. So the question is the effectiveness that, for in one side, the effectiveness has had feedback from the actors connected to protected areas. But on the other side, the person is also saying, is the effectiveness model going to be shared? And where we can have access, people can have access to the model. So I was thinking that the question was from Mariano, so maybe Mariano, you can speak about that. But Nick, we can also share our presentation. And if people want to try to test this approach in other countries, contact us, and we will be happy to talk about this with more details.
Sí, gracias, Paola. Efectivamente, el modelo global está siendo probado y testeado en este rato, y ahí eso, como dice Paola, lo pueden compartir. El modelo que nosotros estamos usando, que nosotros trabajamos precisamente, en su momento lo hicimos para que permitiera vincularse a la comunidad en términos de que sea un reporte de gestión. Cuando hacemos en las áreas protegidas, nosotros tenemos cuentas públicas, que nosotros le decimos a las personas cómo nos ha ido con la gestión. Y es una parte importante de la gobernanza el dar cuenta de la gestión, qué es lo que hicimos. Y precisamente el modelo de efectividad nos permite ordenar esas cuentas públicas, es decir, mira, no estamos haciendo cualquier cosa, sino que realmente lo que estamos haciendo está teniendo o no está teniendo un resultado, y cómo está vinculado también al bienestar de las personas, que es un componente que nosotros fortalecemos mucho en la gestión del área protegida, cómo lo que nosotros hacemos también tiene un impacto en el bienestar de las personas, tanto visitantes como comunidades locales. Entonces, y lo ideal, y como decía, no es trabajar en un solo componente, no es trabajar solamente en estrategia, sino que al mismo tiempo estar trabajando en la gobernanza. El ideal es que la evaluación de la efectividad de las áreas protegidas se haga en conjunto con los actores locales que son parte de esa gestión compartida. Ese es el ideal que buscamos en algún momento. Si es que vamos a hacer una evaluación de efectividad en un área protegida que tiene, por ejemplo, un consejo consultivo, que esa evaluación de efectividad sea en conjunto con el consejo consultivo, que sea en conjunto con la comunidad local. Porque es importante, o sea, es importante esa valoración también para planificar el siguiente periodo de implementación de la gestión en conjunto. Pero es algo que todavía, eso es claramente algo que todavía nosotros estamos trabajando, hemos hecho bastante avance en términos de vinculación con los actores locales, pero hay mucho por avanzar todavía, y eso es parte de lo que queremos hacer, lograr en un momento que esa evaluación de efectividad no sea solamente del equipo interno, en este caso de CONAF, sino que realmente sea un proceso colaborativo entre los actores del territorio con las comunidades locales.
If I could also build on this, and I'm going to come back to a question that was asked by Dale almost an hour ago. But Dale said, I think one of the most important measures is transparency. Too often management plans and related documents are not made publicly available, even when financed by donors. This really should be a mandatory requirement. And so when I think we think about sharing, it's not just sharing the global framework, it's also encouraging protected areas and systems to share the methodology that they're using and then the results. Obviously, that's up to each system. That's up to the culture of that country and the culture of that agency. But I think that having a common language and sharing is a really important thing that we would like to encourage, because that's where learning happens. And the real brave thing is to share not just your successes, but to share your failures. But I think it's a lot easier to share your failures if you can then show how you're learning from them and how you're reacting and changing to them. But that's obviously a cultural shift that would have to happen. Paula, do you want to talk about Hilda's question?
Yes, sure. So thank you, Hilda. So Hilda is mainly a comment. So it's saying that this activity is very important and and again, reinforcing the need to really assess what we are doing to see if this is really, the strategies are really leading to it, are effective. And there's some thinking about the amount of money that is spent on things that sometimes are not the best things to achieve the outcomes. And is saying that from Red Parques, because Hilda is coming from the coordination of Red Parques, is saying that Red Parques is trying to find mechanism to fund this type of meetings in a in-person way. So thank you, Hilda. That's great. Muchas gracias. Es muy bueno.
Any other questions, comments? We have 2 minutes left.
This comment is saying that if this framework can be used as part of a research or also at a subnational level with provincial government. Yes, sure. And because the question is saying, or should we always connected with the national authority? And voy a cambiar a español porque Luis está preguntando en español. Sí, Luis, la idea es que se pueda usar a diferentes niveles, no necesariamente o solo a nivel nacional. Y eso. Y en cuanto a
Sí,
investigaciones, también, Mariano.
Sí, no, es muy, muy interesante la pregunta de Luis, porque efectivamente se puede implementar, una universidad se puede hacer en la evaluación. Hay que tener claro que sí, siempre cuáles son los criterios. La evaluación de efectividad, la idea es que no sea solamente para mostrar un número, sino que realmente sirva para la gestión. Y en ese caso, siempre es bueno tener, si es que lo hace una universidad, que lo haga en conjunto con el equipo del área protegida, porque para que el área protegida, o sea, la evaluación en el sentido original de evaluarse es para mejorar. Y ahí lo único que pueden mejorar la gestión probablemente son el equipo del área protegida. Y por lo tanto es importante que participen en estos procesos de evaluación de efectividad, no solamente por el conocimiento y la experiencia que tienen para aportar a esa evaluación, sino que además para que ese equipo también sea una autoevaluación y que puedan mejorar y tomar decisiones respecto a esa evaluación. Eso es clave en la idea que no menos nosotros tenemos de evaluación, que no se convierta solamente en una herramienta para evaluar a un equipo, a otro equipo, sino que realmente sea una forma de autoevaluación de los equipos del área protegida para mejorar su gestión. Eso es un poco el que quería comentar.
Great. Well, I think we might let that be the last word for today. I've put my email and Paula's email into the thing. Mariano, you might want to put yours there too, so people can contact you.
Yeah.
I would like to thank Mariano for his presentation. It's very helpful to see specific examples of great work. And thank you to Aaron and the IUCN folks for hosting this webinar. So we appreciate the opportunity. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gracias.
Bye. Chao, chao. Gracias a todos, todas.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.